We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for attending this press conference. I'm State Senator Margaret O'Brien. Today, we're unveiling a package of bills called Protecting Michigan's Children. This is expected to be the first step in preventing sexual abuse of children and young adults. Any package of bills need a strong team in order to be successful. It's my pleasure to introduce our team. I'd like to first introduce the legislators. Starting with my right, we have State Representative Beth Griffin, State Representative Diana Farrington, State Senator Ken Horn, State Senator Marty Nolenberg, State Senator Curtis Hertel, and then at the far left, we have State Representative Laura Cox, State Senator Rick Jones, State Senator David Kniezek, and State Representative Leslie Love. Senator Beto was unable to join us today. Now, additionally, we have other partners. We have many legislators who are not here today who have been very supportive of our efforts. We also have the Attorney General's office and the Governor's office who has both worked with us. Most importantly, the strongest partners have been the courageous survivors who are here today to support this important work that they started, and they're throughout the room. And I know I have not met all of you, but thank you for being here because it is on your shoulders that we stand. Now, finally, I would like to address the media and thank all of you who are here today. Without you being the conduit for these voices to be heard, it is doubtful that Larry Nassar and the broken systems of USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University would have been revealed. So thank you for shining light on this darkness. Now, protecting Michigan's children includes 10 bills. There's Senate Bills 871 through 879 and House Bills 5658 through 5661. This package of bills reflects the work of many months of hard work. The bills include extending the statute of limitations civilly and criminally. The civil statute of limitation bills will also be retroactive back to 1993 when Larry Nassar got his medical license. We also have bills expanding mandated reporters to include youth sports athletic trainers and coaches, regardless of where they volunteer or work, and increase the penalties for mandated reporters who fail to report. Additionally, the bills will ensure no confusion in our laws and specifically state that those who perpetrate and enable sexual assault have no claim to governmental immunity. We are also proposing to allow for anonymous filing in the Court of Claims for sexual assault claims. We know that users of child pornography also sexually abuse children. These bills include increasing the penalties for child pornography. Finally, these bills will also enable prosecutors to more effectively prosecute serial sexual predators by allowing them to use evidence of the predator's prior assaults at trial. We could not introduce this legislation without the strong team that you see here today, both standing behind me and in the audience. Many of these women played integral roles, and it's a privilege to introduce our first speaker. Olympic gold medalist Jordyn Wieber is in her second season as a volunteer assistant coach after spending her first 3 years at UCLA as a team manager. Jordyn coaches the Bruins on floor exercise, an event on which she won a U.S. title in 2011. She was also a finalist on floor exercise at the 2012 Olympics, where she won a team gold medal with the Fierce Five United States squad. Jordyn hails from DeWitt, Michigan, and graduated from UCLA in 2017 with a degree in psychology. She was a 2016 inductee into the Greater Lansing Sports Hall of Fame and is also a member of the USA Gymnastics Hall of Fame as a member of the 2012 U.S. Olympic team. And Jordyn, I think fierce is a great way to describe you in your efforts to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. When I was growing up just a few miles from this state capitol, I had only one dream: to compete in the Olympic Games in gymnastics and represent my country. This dream is shared by thousands of little girls in big cities and small towns throughout Michigan and America. I gave up my childhood in pursuit of this dream, training thousands of hours, enduring unbelievable stress and many painful injuries. The one person I relied upon to treat my injuries and heal my pain inflicted injuries on me far more devastating than the broken bones and torn muscles I suffered in the sport of gymnastics. Despite all of this, I achieved my dream. I proudly stood on the Olympic podium in London and listened to our national anthem as my team and I were awarded our gold medals. I later learned that the terrible price I paid to become an Olympic athlete was shared by hundreds of women in nearly every sport, and some who were not even involved in athletics at all. It is for all of them that I'm here today. We have now learned that the monster who abused me and all of these women did so for more than 2 decades. We also know that Larry Nassar would not and could not have succeeded in his diabolical mission without the acquiescence and neglect of major organizations. Powerful institutions of our federal and state governments, the U.S. Olympic Committee, USA Gymnastics, and Michigan State University all failed to believe the victims and stop a serial child molester. This must never happen again in Michigan or anywhere else. We have learned through many sad examples in our history that, unfortunately, people are held accountable and real change is made only after tragedy. And we are learning that activism can create action that results in change. When more than 250 women stood up in court and we gave our deeply emotional and personal accounts of our abuse, it captured the attention of the world, the nation, and leaders of our state. I am proud today to stand with Senator Margaret O'Brien and many of these leaders in our state legislature to announce some sweeping changes in Michigan law. The package of bills that are being introduced into the legislature today will protect Michigan children and survivors from childhood sexual abuse now and in the future. These dedicated legislative leaders and my fellow survivors will speak in more detail about what is contained in this landmark package of legislation. Let me just say that it will make necessary and sweeping changes in criminal and civil law that will protect children, hold abusers and their enablers accountable, and guarantee every survivor their day in court. When I stood on the Olympic podium, I thought that winning a gold medal for my country was the most important thing that I could accomplish in my life. I now realize that that was just the beginning. Together, we will change our laws and our culture so that every child will be valued, respected, and protected. Thank you.
I think your testimony says it all. Thank you. The next person that I would like to introduce you to is also a fierce young woman who has become a brave symbol to many, Lindsey Lemke. Lindsey was one of the first survivors to become public, and as a current student at Michigan State University, she has been a voice for change. When Lindsey first decided to publicly identify herself as a survivor of sexual assault, she did so as a student and collegiate gymnast, standing up against coaches and the institution that had defended her sexual assailant for decades. Lindsey is now a student coach and team captain for the Michigan State University women's gymnastics team and has continued to be the voice dedicated to speaking the truth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. In 2016, I decided to publicly identify myself as a victim of Larry Nassar. I had the opportunity to make a victim impact statement at Larry Nassar's sentencing in Ingham County Court in January, along with many other brave and courageous women. We created an army of survivors. Today, our state's leaders, and specifically Senator O'Brien, joined that army. Thank you, Senator O'Brien, for everything that you have done and are continuing to do for all survivors of sexual assault. Today is an amazing first step in bringing Michigan's laws up to date with the rest of the United States. You have heard from some amazing and brave women so far, and I'd like to share my story with you. Like many gymnasts, I began my career extremely young. I actually started off in dance class, but the entire class, I would just watch the gymnastics class next door and get in trouble. My parents figured out that gymnastics is where I needed to be, and I love the sport. I moved to Holt, Michigan, so I could attend John Geidert's notorious Twist Stars gym. If you wanted to be a successful gymnast, this is where you went. As the successes increased, so did the injuries. We were pushed to the limits, which were often extreme. Our young, growing bodies became cracked and crippled under the strain, but we were blessed. We were lucky. We had the doctor who treated the Olympians and the elite gymnast, Larry Nassar. Little did I know that this one man would not only change mine and my family's life, but he would completely alter the lives of hundreds of women and families. John in the gymnastics world was cruel, but Larry was nice. He was our safe haven. He said he was on our side. He defended us. He was our listening ear after hard practices. He asked how we were doing. He cared about us. He sometimes even gave us gifts, often Olympic memorabilia. This was all a lie, though. I, along with so many others, was being groomed by a serial pedophile. I was only 10 years old when Larry Nassar first abused me. He continued to abuse hundreds of times over the years. My innocence was stolen and my childhood forever changed. I was not protected by the institutions that were put there to protect me. I am currently a student at Michigan State. I actually did not start off attending Michigan State. I first went to the University of North Carolina on a gymnastics scholarship. However, I decided that what I wanted was to come home to my hometown and compete for the school that I always dreamed of and that I loved. I wasn't promised a scholarship. In fact, I was told that I had to earn it, and I did. While I was competing as a Big Ten student athlete for the school that I loved, Rachael Denhollander's brave story spoke, and I realized that my team physician, the Olympic doctor, had abused me. I went to my gymnastics coach at Michigan State, Kathy Klages, and I told her that I thought I was abused by Larry. She told me that I really needed to do my research and to make sure that I was certain of what had happened to me. I did not feel believed. I did not feel trusted. I did not feel safe. I thought that I was going to get in trouble. I was terrified that my scholarship that I worked so hard for was going to be taken away. I was attempted to be silenced, the exact same way so many women were silenced at Michigan State for decades. This legislation will change that. Brave survivors who come forward will not be dismissed. They will not be asked if they are sure or told that they need to do their research. People who know about childhood sexual assault won't be able to simply sweep it under the rug, and if they do, they will be held accountable. We have seen many of these institutions make statements about how they plan to make changes or how the institutions have a new focus to provide better safety for their athletes. As I have said in the past, talk is cheap, but this legislation is not talk, it is action. I am so thankful that we have senators, and especially Senator O'Brien, that are taking action for all survivors. This legislation enables us to not be victims, but to be survivors. It gives all survivors a voice. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and it's our privilege to have your voice heard today. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Larissa Boyce. She is an inspirational symbol of courage and bravery in our society. Larissa wears many hats. She's a wife, mother of 4 beautiful children, a Spartan, and a survivor. Larissa is here today because she did exactly what we tell our children to do when something bad, uncomfortable, or wrong happens to them. She told an adult. When Larissa was sexually assaulted by Larry Nassar in 1997, at only 16 years old, she had the courage to speak up. Unfortunately, no one listened in 1997. But today, she's here to speak, and we are listening. Larissa hopes the mandatory reporter legislation we are introducing today will help prevent the abuse that she suffered from happening to other young girls. I think that it's important for us to add that if the penalties had also been increased for mandatory reporters, maybe that would have changed the story for some other women who are here today. So we really appreciate, Larissa, you being here today to help us expand the mandatory reporter legislation, but also to increase the penalties so those who keep silent, that they will pay a price because they shouldn't be keeping silent your voice. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today, and thank you for that kind of introduction. I never would have imagined that I would be using my story to address the public and legislature on such a personal and important topic. But I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do so. I've lived in the Lansing area my entire life. I grew up rooting for the Spartans and loving MSU's campus. It was like a second home to me, even before I became a student at MSU. The majority of my childhood was spent at MSU, whether it was taking family bike rides, feeding the ducks on the banks of the Red Cedar, or the hours and hours I spent training at Jennison Fieldhouse, refining my gymnastics skills and routines under the Spartan Youth Gymnastics program. Over the last year or so, I've had to come to the realization that the MSU adults and leaders that I looked up to, they failed me when I was only a naive, trusting 16-year-old. That truth has made the situation even more difficult to comprehend. Spartans are supposed to be leaders. Adults are supposed to do the right thing. My alma mater is supposed to protect their students, their athletes, and their community. Unfortunately, I have experienced firsthand that that does not always happen. This is why laws are so important and why changes need to be made to ensure the protection of our children and victims of sexual abuse. I've always loved being a competitive gymnast, and I strive to compete at the collegiate level. My dream was to do that at MSU. In pursuit of that goal, my parents enrolled me in the Spartan Youth Gymnastics program, which was run by then head gymnastics coach, Kathy Klages. I made lifelong friendships and learned lasting lessons through the beautiful sport of gymnastics. However, my time spent there is not all fond memories. Gymnasts regularly push their bodies to the breaking point, and so injuries are common. When I suffered an injury, Kathy Klages and other coaches would send us to see Larry Nassar, whose reputation as an Olympic doctor gave him a godlike status in the gymnastics world. This doctor was the doctor that worked on my heroes, my role models, and I felt privileged to see him. And as we now know, Larry Nassar abused his position of trust and authority in the most unspeakable ways. My treatments with him left me extremely uncomfortable. It felt wrong, so I did what my parents told me to do when I felt uncomfortable or that something wrong had happened. I told a trusted adult. I told the head coach of my gymnastics program, Kathy Klages, back in 1997. This was not an easy decision to make. I was only 16 years old, and Larry was the revered Olympic doctor. Instead of being believed, I was questioned, I was embarrassed, and I was humiliated by Kathy. She did not notify the proper authorities or even my parents. Instead, she told the man who was abusing me that I went to her with my concerns. In turn, this only enabled and empowered Nassar to keep abusing and feel like he was invincible. I was brainwashed into thinking that I was wrong and that I must have a dirty mind. Two of the most trusted adults in my life programmed me into believing that this was a valid medical treatment. And over the next 4 years, I continued to be assaulted by Larry Nassar, and so were countless others. My story is only one example of why this statute of limitation laws need to change. I told trusted adults back in 1997 and was conditioned to believe that I was receiving legitimate medical treatment. For the past 20 years, I accepted that distorted reality. I did not know until last year that my intuitions were correct, and I was in fact sexually abused at the age of 16. Imagine if Kathy had done the right thing and reported this abuse back in 1997. Hundreds, if not thousands, of girls and women could have been spared from the pain and betrayal that this sexual abuse inflicted upon us. This is also one reason why mandatory reporting laws need to be more specific and include increased penalties if reports are not properly handled. Enablers need to be held accountable. Michigan's mandatory reporting laws were passed to protect children. I know the courage it takes to come forward and report abuse. In fact, it is an incredibly difficult thing to do. We need to strengthen our laws to ensure that we do not fail our future generations. One abused child is one too many. We need to make clear to coaches and all other adults who interact with children that they must report abuse. If they fail to report, they must be punished and held accountable. In some way, it is sad that we need laws to punish people from doing the right thing in the first place. However, as my story shows, we cannot always believe that the people we entrust our children to will do the right thing. Most of the girls sitting in this room would not be where they are today had Kathy done the right thing back in 1997. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you for doing the right thing 20 years ago, and for your courage then and doing the right thing and your courage today. We appreciate it. The next person I'd like to introduce is Sterling Riethman, who hails from my hometown of Kalamazoo County, where I represent. Sterling's a former gymnast and collegiate diver for Denison University. As a student, she majored in communications and minored in psychology. On one of her social media accounts, Sterling describes herself as wife, survivor, advocate for change. Though the criminal cases have come to a close, Sterling has picked up the banner of advocacy and education for survivors everywhere. It was on December 5th that Sterling and Rachael had met with me and other legislators at a roundtable and shared her concerns about the inadequate protections afforded to sexual abuse victims in the state of Michigan. She was articulate and persuasive then, and is even more so today. Nassar was sentenced in Lansing, and when she told the court, "Our words today are simply the start," I think that was a prophecy. We are here today because of her diligence and strength.
Thank you all for joining us today. It is an honor to stand beside our state senators and my fellow sister survivors to support this legislative package that will help survivors all over the state find the justice they so deserve and help us put an end to this culture of abuse that is sweeping our nation. I want to start off today by telling you a story. About a year ago, I was getting coffee with a friend. We were catching up on life. She was asking about updates on the case and how I was doing. I had said something along the lines of myself and the other victims. And my friend said, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why do you choose the word victim instead of survivor when you talk about the case?" Without skipping a beat, I replied, "I can't confidently use the word survivor without knowing the pain and suffering is over. I can't call myself a survivor until I know I came out on the other side of this." She looked confused, so I went on to explain that our justice system in the state of Michigan is a very difficult process for survivors of sexual abuse, and to hear that you may or may not be able to find justice because of the way our legislation is written is a very difficult pill to swallow. You have to recognize that even though someone may have committed a heinous crime against you, there may be nothing that can be done to prevent it from happening to another young girl, let alone to help you find justice. And that's not an easy thing to deal with. So no, I was not yet a survivor. I hadn't earned that title yet. So now let's flash forward to a year later, and today I stand here in front of you unafraid to use the word survivor. I am a victim no more, with many people to thank for their hard work, but today I say thank you to this passionate group of senators. The work being done here in Michigan shows that we will no longer protect predators and their enablers as opposed to the victims. We will shift the mindset to protecting survivors of abuse and approach the handling of sexual abuse cases much differently than we have historically. This legislative package shows that the leadership of our state is listening, recognizing there's opportunity for improvement, and acting upon those opportunities with swift and impactful recommendations for change. Up until this point, we have treated sexual assault victims with a one-size-fits-all approach, with expectations for all that in reality few can meet. It is clear, however, that we do not fit into a one-size-fits-all description. For 9 days, my survivor sisters and I stood in courtrooms across Ingham County and Eaton County, each recounting our experience and shouting our truths for the world to hear in a manner unprecedented for this country. Our stories came pouring out one after another, and while the details of our abuse at Larry's hands were wildly similar, our individual circumstances were far from identical. While this legislative package encompasses many factors, of which I will go into more detail tomorrow, I want to focus on a few key points this afternoon. As it stands today, Michigan's statute of limitations is one of the most restrictive in the nation when it comes to survivors of childhood sexual abuse. We find ourselves at the top of a list we don't want to be on, as we rank among the states leading the nation in providing protective environments for predators to thrive and the worst environment for survivors to find justice. Our current statute of limitations requires victims of childhood sexual assault to bring claims by their 19th birthday or within 3 years of the act. Yet when you look at the reporting data for sexual assault survivors, more than 60% of survivors don't tell a single person about their abuse until well into adulthood, ranging from their late 30s to early 40s. Meaning, by the time they recognize their need for justice, it is far too late to pursue it. With this new proposed legislation, we are expanding the statute of limitations to 30 years after the act, or 30 years after the age of majority. We are increasing the extent of mandatory reporters and increasing repercussions should they fail to do so appropriately. With this expansion of mandatory reporters, we are ensuring that the next time a child approaches their coach to say the most difficult sentence that will ever come out of their mouth, that coach will have the legal responsibility to act. That coach will not scold or blame or intimidate. That coach will report. Furthermore, my sister survivors and I are proof that people who commit acts of childhood sexual abuse should not be shielded from civil liability simply because they are a member, employee, agent, or volunteer of a governmental agency. Instead, people who commit acts of childhood sexual abuse need to be held accountable, regardless of position or title. The expectation and understanding that acts of sexual abuse will no longer be tolerated, ignored, or enabled must become the norm. This legislation that Senator O'Brien and her colleagues have introduced shouts that message from the rooftops. Through efforts such as these, instead of ranking at the top of the list of states that protect predators, we will find ourselves at the top of the list that empowers survivors. It is not a secret that I stand here a survivor of a tragedy that never had to happen. But instead of focusing on the past, I'm choosing to focus on the future. So yes, I stand in front of you today a survivor of sexual abuse. But I stand here a survivor with hope. I stand here a survivor with gratitude to the legislators who are listening, acting, and helping us create a better future for tomorrow. I stand here beside my sisters with the promise and conviction to protect our nation's children no matter the sacrifice. This legislation, this conversation we are having here today, gives survivors hope. It gives survivors life. It gives survivors access to our justice system, and it further restricts a community's ability to enable the predators that live among us. This legislation is essential to a survivor's healing and well-being. It sends survivors the message, you matter. These changes say what happened to you is important and will not go ignored. You matter. I am incredibly proud to stand here with the leaders of our state, challenging the norm for survivors and raising the expectations for organizations and institutions near and far. With this legislative package, we are positioning ourselves to become a leader in the nation in terms of how we handle sexual assault claims. As a state, we are becoming the champion that so many of us needed all those many months ago. We have a responsibility to protect Michigan's children, and this legislative package is an excellent step in doing so. Thank you to those that have tirelessly fought for these changes. Survivors everywhere will thank you. I thank you.
It's easy to get passionate about legislation when you have such amazing women like this that you're working with. The next person to speak is Amanda Thomashow, who's a 28-year-old survivor of sexual assault. Amanda attended Michigan State University to study art and science. She's always been passionate about health and wellness, and even traveled to Cameroon to bring free medical care to the people of, I know I'm going to mess this up, Amanda, Yaoundé? Yaoundé, okay, it was close, and surrounding communities. Amanda graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2012 and decided to return to campus to finish medical school requirements a year and a half later. While studying medicine and working in a pediatrician's office, Amanda sought treatment for chronic lower back, hip, and pain. In 2014, at the age of 24, Amanda was sexually assaulted by Larry Nassar. Now, Amanda knew she had been abused and reported it to Michigan State University. But the resulting Title IX investigation further victimized Amanda. It relied on the statements of Nassar's hand-picked friends and determined she didn't understand the nuanced differences between sexual assault and an appropriate medical procedure. The investigation also led to multiple reports, though she was only privy to one. In the years following the botched investigation, Amanda was filled with shame and self-doubt. She was fearful of how being a victim of sexual assault would affect her life, so she stayed anonymous. Only in the days preceding Nassar's sentencing, surrounded by an army of sister survivors, did Amanda feel comfortable going public. Today, Amanda is no longer afraid. Today, Amanda is using her voice to help those who haven't found theirs yet. And today, Amanda stands proud as a survivor with hopes of a better, safer tomorrow. Please join me in welcoming Amanda.
In the wake of tragedy, we often find ourselves asking why. After over 200 of my sister survivors and I bravely stood up to our abuser, I find myself doing just that. I cannot help but wonder why. Why did he do it? Why did he think his personal pleasure outweighed our right to live lives free from such unnatural and unfair afflictions? Why was he able to hurt so many women and children? Why did he get away with it for decades? Why did it take so long for anyone to listen? And why did it take so long for anyone to act? I find myself full of questions like these, questions I may never know the answer to. I also find myself asking how. How did this happen, and how do we ensure that it never happens again? These questions I find much easier to answer. These questions, though sometimes harder to ask because they involve cultural introspection and accountability, can lead us to important and necessary change, if only we let them. Now is the time for new, victim-centric public policy that reflects just how serious sexual assault is. The new legislation we are here to discuss today does exactly that. These laws will give victims of childhood sexual assault the time they need and deserve to process and understand abuse before reporting it. Many of the women that stood less than a mile from this very building last month were facing their abuser years, even decades later. Listen to their stories. Show them their voices still matter. Do everything you can to support and protect these victims and others just like them. Make the necessary decisions to ensure that this never happens again. As a sister in this powerful army of survivors, I can tell you, no matter how fresh or scarred over our wounds are, we all feel the same pain. And we all deserve the same justice without a timeline for our grief or a deadline for our recovery. Today, we are here reopening these wounds and channeling our pain in hopes of our collective story being a catalyst for change. When a survivor is ready to tell her story, we need to be ready to listen and act. Our legislation should demand that. This legislation does. These laws will also protect both anonymous and public victims alike, giving all survivors the justice and privacy they deserve. These laws will require the adults we trust with our children to report abuse. If such figures of authority had been mandatory reporters when Larissa first spoke out against the abuse she experienced, 2 decades worth of my sister survivors may have been spared. I could have never met the former doctor that abused me, and neither would hundreds of victims that suffered at his hands. We need laws that make it inexcusable for the adults that work with young people to ignore or mishandle allegations of sexual assault. We need laws that include appropriate consequences when these adults do not act. This new legislation will also remove immunity from government officials and agencies that perpetrate and enable sexual assault. This is so incredibly necessary. No one should be excused from such despicable behaviors, no matter their position or stature. Any abuse is unacceptable. and the abuser's title should not diminish that. If we have learned anything from this tragedy, it is that we need to argue less and listen more. When someone suffers a sexual assault and finds the courage to report it, we need to offer them support and take action. No longer can we allow victims to share their stories just to be met with doubt or shame. Too often when a survivor of sexual assault speaks out, they are silenced by lack of support, mixed messages, and misplaced blame. Survivors are stripped of their credibility and their character is questioned. They are bullied into submission and shamed into isolation. This is unacceptable. It is time for our laws to protect and empower victims, not their abusers. So we ask ourselves, where do we go from here? We have a chance to make a difference and to treat injustices with the proper response. We have an opportunity to make some serious positive movement, which leads me to my last question. Will you take it?
Amanda, we are listening and we believe you. Now, this last introduction is a little bit more personal. I'd like to introduce Rachael Denhollander. Best I can figure it, I've known Rachael for at least 18 years, if not longer. And when you met Rachael 18 years ago, she looked like any other person, any other young teen who knew the pain and the triumphs and the tragedy that she was going through. You hit it so well. Now, Rachael will say she's never set out to be an icon of the movement against child abuse. However, she's become a force to be reckoned with, a fierce advocate for truth, change, fairness, and justice. She often explains this is not a platform she ever wanted, but embraces the platform to promote her passions for advocacy and education on the issues. Rachael was the first to file a police report with the Michigan State University Police Department against Larry Nassar. As she explained when questioned during a preliminary hearing and in her impact statement, she reported armed with a mountain of evidence to help law enforcement bring Nassar to justice. She was the first to report and the last to speak at the sentence hearings, leaving the world with the unanswered question, how much is a little girl worth? A graduate of Oak Ridge College of Law, Rachael is an attorney by training. However, her most important roles are as wife and mother. She homeschools her children ages 6, 3, and 2. Her husband, Jacob, a doctoral student at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, would like to teach theology, and right after he earns his degree and serve in leadership at a church. If you've never heard Rachael speak before, you'll see why it was so easy to pick up this cause on behalf of so many deserving women. Thank you, Rachael.
Good afternoon. I am grateful beyond what I can express to be standing here today in the company of my courageous sister survivors and in the company of courageous leaders who today have taken a stand to make Michigan a safer place for our children and for women. Michigan has ranked at the very bottom of the country in key areas related to protecting victims of sexual assault, but I am proud to say that the legislative package unveiled today will become a blueprint for our country. This comprehensive legislative reform not only offers significantly greater protection to our children moving forward, but it also opens up access to our justice system for many victims of sexual assault whose voices have yet to be heard. Our legal system was designed with 3 specific purposes: pursuing justice against those who have harmed others, restoring those who have been harmed, and preventing further harm from occurring. Our system provides 2 main avenues for reaching these goals. First, it provides the criminal prosecution process. And second, it provides civil litigation as an additional means for pursuing these 3 goals. The criminal prosecution of sexual abusers and enablers establishes justice through appropriate penalties for violations of the criminal code. And you will see in this legislative package a number of measures designed to further pursue this aim, including vital revisions to the criminal statute of limitations for 2nd and 3rd degree sexual assault, increasing the penalties for violating mandatory reporting laws, revising statutes related to the possession of child pornography to create a new class of aggravated felony which carries significantly higher penalties for those who exploit children through the possession of child pornography, and a measure to allow the admission of certain evidence of prior sexual assault into a criminal trial for the purposes of establishing a pattern of behavior. Each of these provisions are vital components of needed reform in Michigan and essential to the pursuit of justice. But there is also a second avenue that we are provided for pursuing justice as well, the civil litigation process. And in our country, this is the primary process for pursuing institutional reform and justice against individuals and entities who have either participated directly in sexual assault or who have enabled it. And in this legislation package, you will see as well essential steps taken to ensure that the victims have access to our court system to pursue justice. These provisions include dramatically increasing the civil statute of limitations for periods against individuals or institutions who knew or should have known that sexual assault was occurring. It includes removing the statute of limitations for civil claims against government institutions. It removes sovereign immunity protections for claims related to sexual assault so that our government can truly be accountable and for the people. And it allows childhood victims of sexual assault to protect their identities when they file a civil claim. Research has consistently shown that it takes years, often decades, for survivors of sexual assault to be able to speak out against their abusers. The average age of disclosure for a sexual assault survivor is 41 for women and age 38 for men. These revisions to the statute of limitations will give sexual assault survivors who have never been able to speak before access to our justice system. This is access they need, and this is access they deserve. Each provision above not only allows for a greater pursuit of justice, but it also aids the two additional purposes for our court systems: the restoration of those who have been harmed and the prevention of further abuse. Through laws which increase criminal penalties and remove bars to pursuing both criminal and civil complaints, survivors of sexual assault are able to seek healing and restoration for the damage done to them. In a state where their voices had previously been silenced and their access to justice was cut off. Through laws which strengthen mandatory reporting requirements, place greater penalties on those who fail to protect our children, and provide additional avenues to pursuing institutional reform, individuals and institutions will be subject to greater accountability and greater responsibility for protecting the most vulnerable among us, our children. Just a few weeks ago in our state and our nation became riveted by the stories of 256 women who gave victim impact statements in Ingham and Eaton counties during the sentencing hearings for one of the most prolific pedophiles in U.S. history. We came face to face with the devastation of sexual assault. We saw what it looked like when individuals and institutions fail horrifically to protect our children. And it is a lesson we must never forget. Because not only do these courageous women, who showed you their faces and told you their stories, deserve justice, so does every other Me Too in our state. Behind every story you were privileged to hear, there are hundreds more stories and hundreds more survivors who have yet to gain their voice. They are little girls and little boys, men and women, whose voices have not been heard, who are still living in silence, who until this legislative reform is passed do not have access to our justice system. And it is also important for you to know that even before these women spoke, this group of legislators here with us today heard our voices. When I approached Senator O'Brien regarding legislative reform, she was passionate and dedicated and already committed to the cause. When Sterling Riethman and I met with a key group of senators to discuss the weaknesses in Michigan law, these leaders listened. They cared. They cared before it hit the national press. And it was one of the first times ever that leaders in our state listened and immediately chose what was right over what was easy and politically expedient. I am grateful for their leadership. Their leadership is a model that I hope will be followed by every senator and representative in our state, as this legislative package is brought before committees and legislative floors. We have had enough in Michigan of political leaders who look the other way. We have had enough of political leaders who care more about institutions and parties than little boys and little girls. We have had enough of leaders who pay attention to lobbyists interested in protecting institutions and dollars instead of caring for the children. 256 women chose to stand against their community, stand against the tide, and to speak out on sexual abuse despite the pain and despite the cost. I hope with everything in me that the senators and representatives, every single one of them, who will soon be voting on this legislation in committee and on the floors, will have the same courage, the same fortitude, the same commitment to truth and what is right as these 256 women demonstrated 1 month ago. It is time again to answer the question, how much is a little girl worth? But now it really must be asked on behalf not just of the survivors of Larry Nassar, but on behalf of every sexual assault survivor in our state. How much is a child worth? How much is a human being worth? How much are those who have been victimized worth? Because their voices matter every bit as much. And as every day that this legislative package is not pushed forward through committee to the Senate floor, out of the Senate, into the House committees, into the House floor, and onto the governor's desk, every day we wait is a day that their voices are not heard, is a day that they are not protected. And so I call on our senators and our representatives and our governor to get this legislation passed before we are done with committee and caucuses this year, before we recess for summer. My third daughter, is due in July, and I want my little girl to be born into a world that is safer because of what we have been done today. So pass this legislation. Don't wait. You must answer the question, how much is a child worth? My greatest hope is that every senator and representative and political leader will answer, worth everything. Worth the greatest measure of protection that the law can offer. Thank you.
Well, my fellow representatives and senators, I think we were given our timeline before Rachel gives birth to baby number 4 here. So it's easy for us to fight when we're surrounded by these strong, brave, and articulate women. And as Rachel said to me when we met last December, we hope that people will do what is right because it's the right thing to do. But if they won't, maybe they will do what is right because they do not want to face the penalties for doing wrong. Statistics tell us that 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. So think of all the men and women who surround you that you don't know their true stories. But today is the day we fight for justice. Justice for the women you see here, and justice for the hundreds of thousands of women, men, girls, and boys around our state. There will be more work for us to do in the future. This package of bills will go a long way in protecting Michigan's children. Now, this is a conclusion of the press conference. I did want to give the opportunity for any of the other survivors who are in the room, if you wish to stand, and you don't have to feel pressure to do so, if you wish to stand to be available for any media interviews afterwards, feel free to stand now. It's your choice. There is no pressure. All of the women here and the legislators here will be available. So any women? And that's okay if you don't want to stand. That is fine because your presence here is enough. We can take a couple questions briefly. Thank you. I have to say that it's very courageous because, you know, when you think about 1 in 5 women, 1 in 20 men have been sexually abused as a child, what that means is there's a lot of silence. There's people who you love, who you consider very close to you, and they've never told you their darkest secret. So thank you for your courage. We do have time for a few group questions before we make everyone available for individual interviews.
Senator, have you considered any funding component? You're increasing mandatory reporting. Potentially, you could put greater strain on, for instance, Child Protective Services to deal with these reports. Do you think they're adequately funded right now to be able to handle more complaints? Is that a consideration you've given?
If it's discovered they need more money, the legislature will appropriate more money. I think it's safe to say I've not heard a single representative or senator have concern with this package of bills. A number of them have already been briefed, so we are committed to providing whatever funding we have to do to protect Michigan's children.
Could you speak a little bit to the scope of the package, how the process came together, putting it together, and were there other pieces maybe that were left out that you'd like to see addressed?
You know, there's a number of great ideas that have been brought forth, both senators and representatives. So up here is just a small group of legislators who are committed. We only had 10 bills, so these were the lucky 10 who got to sponsor one. And we've gotten a lot of ideas. So what we did is we put them into phases. The first phase is what we know we learned from Michigan State University and USA Gymnastics, where the flaws in the system are. And there's a number of these colleagues here who I've spoken with individually or in group settings who had a passion about one particular issue or another. There will be additional rounds of legislation sponsored by, it could be some of the people up here, but also by other representatives and senators. I'm working with a fair number of them. Those are going to be some of the harder issues to tackle. Ultimately, preventing child abuse. How do we do that? How do we train mandated reporters? These are just a number of the things that we're looking into, but those answers are much harder to come by. So that will be, we expect that and many other ideas in a second or third phase. Today is what we knew for facts that was very well vetted that we could get across the finish line, but we're not stopping to work on this. This is a dedicated group of senators and representatives behind us, and I think you saw by the 6 women who spoke, they're going to hold our feet to the fire. They're not going to let us quit after this and call it a victory. There's a lot more we have to do. It's just as you go through each phase, it's going to get harder and harder. I'm not interested in passing a bill to feel good. I only want a bill to become law if it actually makes a real positive change. Yes.
I have a question specifically about Representative Cox's House Bill 5658. How is this different from just the standard prior acts admissible in the 404B? Is this going to be easier to get those prior sexual assault acts in, or how is this?
Well, basically what it does is...
Come up here.
Basically what it does is it sets up a tier for prior acts, and if there's an evidence taken, so any prior acts that occurred later than 10 years can be captured, and the judge can weigh the evidence prepared, and they can make these decisions based on that 404B, I think is what it is, language. So it just gives a couple tiers of ways to admit prior acts, which we want to make sure that we're stopping the predatory acts of serial rapists. Thank you.
Yes.
So that's actually a provision I am very passionate about, so I'd like to speak to that for a moment if I may. 404B, the provisions that we have right now and the statutes provide revised statutes, what that's going to do is essentially open up some of those evidentiary rules in ways that we already have in process for childhood sexual assault. This was actually a very key provision for me in coming forward. Because when I found out that we had these prior acts, evidence for childhood sexual assault, that was a key component in my decision to come forward and speak against Larry, because it meant that it was all of a sudden not my voice alone against a nationally renowned, acclaimed physician. And so to be able to show that pattern of behavior, those are key pieces of evidence that you'll often have to rely on with these types of cases. Had we not had that in place for childhood sexual assault, it would have been much more difficult to catch Larry. It would have been much more difficult for me to speak up. And so I am incredibly passionate about this particular piece of legislation, to see other sexual assault survivors have that same protection that I had when coming forward. And it is important to note that all of the evidence that would be admitted still has to pass the 403 requirements for relevancy, for not being unduly prejudicial. All those protections are still in place. It simply allows you to demonstrate a pattern of behavior the exact same way we were able to demonstrate a pattern of behavior for Larry. And that is extremely important for pursuing justice against repeat sexual offenders.
She's a gifted attorney. Now, that particular bill, I do want to point out, we were unable to get a double blue back in time. And for those who don't know what that means, typically legislation, when you're ready to introduce it, it has a blue back. It has a blue piece of paper attached to it. And for 9 of the bills, we have them either introduced in both chambers or just in the Senate. We were unable to get the double for Representative Cox's bill right away, so her bill will be picked up in the House as it moves forward. So we'll be having testimony on 9 of the 10 bills tomorrow, but we will pick up the important bill of Representative Cox's. So don't think just because you don't see her bill on the agenda tomorrow, that's according to the Senate rules. It doesn't mean we're not passionate about it. Thank you. So I think that will conclude all of our questions. We do have people who are available for individual interviews. Again, I appreciate you being here, because if it wasn't for the journalists stepping up and uncovering the truth to this story, I don't know if we would have gotten here as quickly as we did. And I know 20 years is not very quick, Larissa, but maybe it would have been 21, 22. So thank you to the journalists for covering this.